Welcome to another reflection from the Northwestern Baptist Association, through which we encourage you to spend some time thinking about some verses from the Bible, and then if you can, to get in touch with someone else who can also watch this video so that you can maybe share together something of what it has meant for you. And I sense that making that effort to keep in touch with someone and to connect with our faith might well be important, as it seems that once again we are facing increasing restrictions and lockdown, not only here in the Northwest, but it seems right across the country. And of course, with that will come the inevitable worries and concerns about the ongoing threat to our health and our well-being. And it doesn't look as if any of that is going to be going away anytime soon. And that will take its toll on us. We're all likely to be feeling increasingly stressed and perhaps isolated. So I hope that these thoughts might be a small help to you in all of that. And I want to invite us in this reflection to spend a bit of time exploring one of the episodes that's recorded for us in the days immediately after Jesus rose from the dead. And it's a conversation between Jesus and one of his disciples, Simon Peter, who went on to be recognized as a central figure in the life of the early church. But in this episode, when it takes place, Peter is feeling like anything but a leader. He is shattered and he's bewildered and he's probably quite traumatized. Now, we've got to recognize that whenever we look at the stories of the Gospels, we do so from the distance of centuries of hindsight. And it might well do us good to remember how raw and how disturbing some of those events must have been for those who were involved at the time. So yeah, of course, we regularly tell the story of the death and the resurrection of Jesus, and we gather on Easter Day and we declare that Jesus is alive. And in today's context, that is a cause for massive celebration. And yet it must have also been a tremendous reality for those early disciples to encounter. But I don't think that we should underestimate the emotional trauma that they still must have experienced through all of these events, because they were devoted to Jesus and they'd witnessed amazing miracles and they'd heard profound teaching and they just loved the guy. And as we consider that, then we realize how awful, how sickening it must have been for them to witness his death. But of course, this was no ordinary death. It was a gruesome and barbaric and agonizing death, and they watched it happen. And they watched it happen with that gut-wrenching recognition that this was all the outcome of a conspiracy of the powerful and a blatantly unjust trial, and so I could go on. And on top of all of that grief and horror would have been all those feelings of guilt and self-doubt and betrayal as they wondered whether they could or whether they should have done more to protect Jesus. And then, while you're still going through all that, to meet that person risen from the dead, it wouldn't have just wiped all of those emotions and traumas away. And they had a whole load of others to deal with, as they were both overjoyed and bewildered and confused as they got their heads around this idea that Jesus was alive. So their emotions would have been in shreds. And what I want us to recognize in all of that is that God's word embraces and speaks to people who are in that sort of state. So as we are confronted by our own fears and struggles, and as we face the trauma of dashed hopes and ongoing uncertainties and the sheer weariness of this prolonged season of disruption and vulnerability, God's word has something to say to us, because stories like ours comprise an awful lot of its content. And that's the kind of baggage that Peter brought into this conversation with Jesus. But for Peter, it was actually worse than that, because alongside everything that I've imagined above, Peter also brought the reality that he had let Jesus down. He denied him. And he'd kept his head down like a coward at the crucial moment when he felt he should have stood up to be counted. And that wouldn't have been so bad if he hadn't spouted his mouth off just before it all happened, assuring Jesus that he would never let him down, even if everybody else did. And as the conversation between him and Jesus progressed, it also became clear that Jesus knew that Simon Peter had let him down, and Jesus knew that Peter knew, and well, I'm sure you can kind of get the picture. Talk about an elephant in the room. It was awkward and it was difficult and it was stressful and it was disturbing. And that's the kind of mess that Peter was in as Jesus took him to one side and they began to talk. So yeah, if you're feeling a bit shattered by current events, if you're bringing so much baggage into your conversation with God that you just don't know where to start, then take heart, because you're not the first person to begin a conversation with God in that kind of state. And I sense, therefore, that the record of what was said might well have some useful things to say to us. So let's read it together as we find it recorded in John's Gospel and chapter 21. When Jesus had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." And Jesus replied, "Feed my lambs." And again Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And he answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." And the third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." And then he said to him, "Follow me." So there's Peter, overwhelmed by trauma and hope and expectation and guilt and 1,001 other emotions. And here's Peter feeling shattered and emotionally drained. Here's Peter with dozens of questions running around in his head, questions about what has happened, about why it's happened, about what's gonna happen to him, to Jesus, to his fellow disciples. And I sense that recent events for us may not have been quite on the same scale as those which Peter and Jesus had faced. But many similar questions might well be spinning around in our heads at the moment. And Jesus just cuts through it all. And basically, in what he asks, he pretty much asserts that it all boils down to one simple thing. Do you love me? And just in case Peter didn't get it, he asked that question 3 times. Simon, to use his official name, son of John, do you love me? And I think there's something quite profound in that, because I have found myself asking or being asked so many questions in recent days. What's happening? What will happen? Should our churches open? Should they stay closed? Will they even survive? Will I survive? Will my loved ones be okay? Can I cope? Can they cope? Where is God in all of this? Is God in all of this? These questions just come, and every one of them is utterly reasonable and understandable. But Jesus just turns this around and he says to Simon Peter, who has a whole raft of similar questions, "Yeah, but do you love me? Have I blown it? Can you forgive me? Can I forgive myself? What will people think of me? If you're alive, why did you have to die in the first place? What does all this mean now?" "Peter," says Jesus, "the question I am asking you is, do you love me?" And I want to offer you that question as a way of making sense of your own faith in these hugely troubling times. I don't know the answer to half of the questions that are flying around at the moment, but the question that Jesus seems to be asking us through this story is the question that he has asked of his people for generations. Do you love me? Because I think that's all that Jesus really requires of us. And that is something that is within our grasp. Whether our churches are open or closed, whether our circumstances are reasonably manageable or completely bewildering, either we love Jesus or we don't. And our capacity to love Jesus, to answer yes to that question, is not affected by anything that may be happening in our wider world. We can love God. We can love Jesus no matter what. And as Peter responds positively to that question, then Jesus offers a very simple command. Feed my sheep, care for my lambs, or to put it simply, look after each other. And I want us to maybe pause and just notice what Jesus' priority is here. He doesn't tell Peter to organise the church or to set up its leadership structures or to make sure its activities keep going. He doesn't tell Peter to open up church buildings or, for that matter, to keep them closed. He doesn't give us specific instructions for how to cope with a worldwide pandemic, because he has an instruction that works in these and every other circumstance. Look after each other. And notice what an all-encompassing reality that is when Jesus says it. When we read that phrase, feed my sheep, and of course our first instinct is to interpret that metaphorically. Surely what Jesus is saying here is spiritually feed my sheep. And yeah, that may be true. But let's remember that the Jesus who said that had just made breakfast for everyone. The story begins by telling us that they'd been eating. And so Jesus certainly did not neglect people's physical needs and well-being. And with time, one thing that we've learned about ourselves as a human race is that you can't separate out your spiritual well-being from your physical and your emotional well-being. They're all kind of tied up together. And it's interesting too that Jesus shifts his language from sheep to lambs and from care to feed. So again, it feels that there's a whole spectrum of needs and people that Jesus has in view. And we are not neglecting our calling as disciples of Jesus when we seek to look after each other. And it feels to me that this needs to be a priority right now. And then Jesus says, follow me. And I find that an interesting phrase too. Jesus makes direct reference in this conversation to the fact that Peter's life will change. There will come a point when he's not able to be self-reliant and he will need to depend on others. But I'm also reminded that Jesus used these words, follow me, when he first met Peter on the fishing quay and invited him to become a disciple some years earlier. Follow me, he says to them. And of course the circumstances were now going to be very different. Peter's role would be very different. Events will have taken their toll. Their experience of Jesus will now be quite different. But Jesus will not abandon them. They are still invited to journey with Jesus. Jesus will still be there. And yeah, we are having to follow Jesus in a world that is increasingly feeling very different to the one that we've been used to. And it looks as though it's going to remain that way for much longer than perhaps we originally anticipated. Our experience of following Jesus might well also be very different to what it was just a few months ago. But we can still follow Jesus. Jesus will still be a part of that world. And so I want to invite you to have your own conversation with Jesus and to maybe let the record of Peter's conversation guide your thoughts. So find the time and the space for you to spend some time with these verses from John chapter 21 and simply allow yourself to ponder these three statements for yourself. Do you love me? And as you seek to answer that question, hear the reassurance that's contained within it. As Peter himself says, Jesus knows that he loves him. But Peter needed to allow that love to define his future relationship with Jesus. Not all the traumas and the disappointments and the fears and the frustrations of the events he'd been through. And take your time in answering that question. Jesus asked it 3 times. Jesus asked, do you really love me? Not because he doubted it was true, but because he wanted Peter to explore and express the depth of that love. So take time to explore and express the depth of the love that you have for Jesus. Feed my sheep, care for my lambs. Don't be afraid of recognizing and acknowledging that we all need to take care of each other in these difficult times. And that's not a distraction from our faith, it's an expression of it. And remember that you can't look after others if you don't look after yourself. And don't be afraid of receiving help and support from others. Jesus called us to be a community, a body, not a group of lone rangers, old, young, physical, spiritual, emotional. Who needs your care? Who can you care for? What can you offer? What care do you need to receive? Hear those words of Jesus, feed my sheep, care for my lambs. And then thirdly, follow me. Jesus offers us his presence, not a roadmap or an instruction book. So yeah, as you acknowledge and recognize the uncertain and challenging circumstances that will lie ahead, try to hear the voice of Jesus beckoning you as you seek to confront them. The experience may be different, but my presence will be made known to you in new ways, says Jesus to his followers. You are not being left to walk this road alone. Jesus invites you to follow him into and through whatever is required of us in the days ahead. So I hope you can draw some strength and some clarity from this very honest but straightforward conversation between the risen, living Jesus and a very troubled and confused and traumatized disciple at a very real and difficult, tough moment in his own life journey. And through it, I hope you may be able to connect a little more with the living Jesus as you confront your own challenges in these difficult days. Thanks for listening.